Morning, folks. This is Ben Brower. I am the section supervisor of the energy planning section in the Montana Energy Office at the Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you all for joining our grid resilience and reliability public hearing today. We are recording this webinar just as a heads up. We're going to get started with just a quick overview of the agenda and brief hello from Dan Lloyd, the Bureau Chief Director of our Energy Office here at DEQ. And then jump right into it. So, Dan, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and come on screen, I'll jump to the agenda and you can walk us through what our plan for today is.
Great, thanks, Ben, and thank you all for joining us today. So, as Ben said, we're just going to start with a quick, brief introductory remarks from myself, cover a little bit about what it is that the Montana Energy Office does, and then we're going to hear from Emily Barrett, who is a senior power systems engineer with PNNL, currently on detail as a technical advisor to DOE's Grid Deployment Office, and get a little bit of DOE perspective from her. Following that presentation, I'm going to give some general background on what I've been calling a few different things, but the State and Tribal Grid Resilience Program is kind of my latest shorthand for it. We were calling it 40101D, which is the section of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that this program was created. But then the real meat of today's presentation is going to be the information on Montana's proposed approach to managing this program. Finally, at the end of the presentation today, there's going to be an opportunity for feedback, and want to add here that there will be future opportunities for feedback moving forward, but really want to encourage discussion today on initial responses to what you hear. So if you can go to the next slide, Ben. So just again, quick introduction to the Montana Energy Office and myself. So Dan Lloyd, and I manage the Montana State Energy Office, which is one of 56 state energy programs. So that's all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and a handful of territories that have DOE recognized state energy programs. And we're all managed a little differently, but what we do in Montana is primarily provide some financing and technical assistance. And so that is around things like our state authorized alternative energy revolving loan program. We have programs around energy and resource efficiency and transportation. And newly, we have the opportunity to provide financing and technical assistance around transmission and distribution. Another big area of our work here at the State Energy Office is around energy planning. So we have state legal obligations, I guess, to provide comment to the Public Service Commission on utility resource plans. We're the state designated entity to manage Emergency Support Function 12, ESF 12, which is related to energy emergencies. And then we also develop and maintain our state energy security plan that's submitted to DOE. And then just briefly, not necessarily related to our conversation today, but the Energy Office does implement a handful of other programs, including the Radon Control Program and Compliance Assistance Program, as well as a handful of other energy-related programs like wind and solar bonding. But with that brief introduction to the Energy Office, I'm going to turn it over to Emily to hear a little bit of the Department of Energy's perspective.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so as Dan mentioned, my name is Emily Barrett. I normally sit at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, but for the last several months and for the foreseeable future, I'm going to be directly supporting the new Grid Deployment Office within the Department of Energy. And, among other things, the Grid Deployment Office is responsible for overseeing and administering the grid resilience provisions within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the IIJA, Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So if we go to the next slide. So there are several provisions within the BIL that speak to grid resilience and provide funding opportunities for grid resilience. And we've organized these roughly in two different buckets. So over the next 5 years, the BIL provides about $13 billion for grid resilience projects. Some of that funding and sort of above in the first part of this table is under the Grid Resilience Formula Grant Program, which is primarily what we're talking about today. And that's $2.3 billion over the next 5 years. And that's allocated funding to states, tribes, and U.S. territories based on a 5-part formula. And so every year, entities will be eligible for a pre-allocated amount of funding for grid resilience projects. So in the case of Montana, that's roughly $7 million a year. The second sort of bucket of funding are competitive funding opportunities, which we've grouped into this Grid Resilience Innovation Program. And across the 3 different programs, that's about $10.5 billion of competitive funding available over the next 5 years. Because these are competitive opportunities, I'm a little bit more limited in what I can say about them. But if folks have questions, I'm happy to sort of say what I can. I will say that for the first 2 programs, the Grid Resilience Industry Grants and the Smart Grid Grants, concept papers for those opportunities were due on December 16th, and DOE will be responding sometime in February. And for the Grid Innovation Program, the concept papers are due pretty soon here on January 13th. So if you go to the next slide. So, even though we're mostly talking today about the formula grant funding, I did want to provide a little bit of context because there is sort of a larger landscape of funding available under the BIL. And, the GRIP program in particular seeks to transform sort of community, regional, interregional, and national resilience. So, really trying to provide transformative funding to provide additional electric grid resilience in consideration of sort of future shifts in generation and load, and really through doing that, catalyze and leverage private sector and non-federal public sector funding to deploy impactful technology and advance infrastructure in the electric sector. And then the last piece, which I'm going to spend a little bit time talking about, is to advance community benefits. And while these are sort of the articulated goals of the GRIP program funding, you'll see a lot of these same themes carry over into some of the articulated goals for the formula grant funding as well. So if we go to the next slide. One of the things that as DOE is reviewing the concept papers for GRIP, for the competitive GRIP funding opportunities, we're really looking at trying to understand the proposed community benefits that would result from these projects. And these plans are being considered across 4 major areas. And the first one is engagement with community-based organizations that really represent local stakeholders and local stakeholder needs. And that includes residential customers, businesses, unions, worker organizations, local government, and what we're currently calling disadvantaged communities. I mean, there's a sort of separate call out along that last one in particular. There's very clearly articulated goals around investment in American workforce through both workforce development and through the creation of and retention of quality jobs with free and fair access to join a union. There are goals articulated, and these goals come from the bipartisan infrastructure law around the advancement of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Again, through these community partnerships and stakeholder engagement. And then the realization of what we're calling Justice 40 goals, which again come from the statute and dictate that at least 40% of the investment benefits of these funds flow to historically disadvantaged or underserved communities. So if we go to the next slide. So the Grid Resilience Formula Grant Program, so this is sort of back to that sort of first bucket of funding, has 4 goals, and these should sound a little bit familiar because they do in many ways echo the GRIP program funding. But we're going to, that these funds will demonstrate measurable improvements to energy resilience to all hazards and mitigate climate-related risk, invest in modernizing grid infrastructure that can enable consumer access to lower cost energy, and then accommodate future grid evolution, including increased electrification, penetration of variable renewable energy resources, distributed energy resources, and evolving future system needs. Enable the clean energy and decarbonization solutions that have been set down by the current administration, and then again, create good paying jobs with free and fair choice to join a union. And so, kind of going back to where I started, the Grid Resilience Formula Grant Program are these pre-allocated formula grants that are available to states, tribes, and U.S. territories. And then the GRIP program funding are these competitive opportunities, but they all sort of exist as a part of the same landscape. And so one of the things that we've asked as we think about and are evaluating the GRIP formula, the GRIP competitive concept papers, is how they align, how projects align with, for instance, state level goals and community goals. So the goal, the DOE's thinking and goal around some of these fundings is that these investments will be transformative, that they will realize meaningful community benefits, and that these projects will amplify one another and will catalyze investment moving forward in modernizing and improving the electric grid and resilience of our electric system. So I think that's the last slide that I was just sort of very, very briefly going to sort of touch on is the next steps for the Formula Grant Program. So program applications for Formula Grant funding for years 1 and years 2, which are the fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 Formula Grant funds, are due March 31st. And applications those applications are really process oriented. So at this point, we are not asking anybody to actually articulate what projects are being proposed, but that the applicants, and in this case, the state of Montana, articulate program objectives and criteria for selecting projects moving forward, how stakeholders are being engaged, including things like this public hearing, and then what the approach will be to sort of identifying, measuring, and realizing community benefits. I talked a little bit about how we've been doing it at DOE around GRIP, and it will be up to Montana to decide how the approach in Montana to recognizing, articulating, and targeting those community benefits. So with that, I will take any questions.
Great, thanks, Emily. I think we'll go ahead and actually hold tight on questions until the end. I think once we get into the meat of Dan's presentation, it will help folks to sort of see how this is going to land here in Montana. But thank you for that introduction to the bigger picture, and for all those who are tuned in today. Emily's been a great resource to us as we wade through this program and understand how it's going to work. So Emily, thanks again for joining us and for that introduction and overview. We're going to jump to Dan now. And as I mentioned in the chat, feel free to drop questions that you have in either the Q&A window or the chat window once Dan's wrapped up his presentation about how this is going to look in Montana. Then we'll go ahead and jump to questions, and folks will have a chance to unmute and offer either feedback, input, or questions that way as well. So Dan, you ready to roll?
I am. Thanks, Emily, and I'll reiterate Ben's point that he just made, that Emily's been a great resource to us as we're setting up this program in Montana. But I would also point out we've had some really great resources through the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO, that represents the state energy offices around the country. But we've also, contacted our colleagues in other states that are setting up their program. And so it's been a great group learning process, and really appreciate the resources that DOE has provided, as well as those other partners. Emily did a great job of providing an overview, so I'm going to be able to run through these next slides pretty quickly. And then, again, get into the meat of it, which is Montana's approach. The point of this slide is simply to illustrate that there's a number of programs and frankly, a large amount of money, over $60 billion to DOE under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, that are relevant to folks on this call today. I'm not going to get into those. And then also that the Montana Energy Office is going to be handling a number of new programs beyond just this grid resiliency funding. And that includes expanded funding for our state energy program, funding to capitalize energy efficiency revolving loan and grant programs. Some of you may recall the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program that was authorized under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That program will be back. We've been working on implementation of our National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funding. It's about $43 million over the life of the program for Montana to set up EV infrastructure. And then obviously the Grid Resilience and Reliability Program that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, Ben. Again, won't spend much time on this one. Emily covered this pretty well, but I'll reiterate that there are other transmission related programs out there. Emily mentioned that there was a round of concept papers that were recently due, and another round that's due just in a week or two here. But I guess again, the point of this slide is simply to say that there are a number of other transmission related provisions under IIJA that are out there. Next slide. So as mentioned, really what we're here today to talk about is the Preventing Outages and Enhancing the Resilience of the Electric Grid formula grants to states and tribes. Again, known by a handful of names. We were calling it 40101D for the longest time, which is the section of the bipartisan infrastructure law that establishes this program. My most recent shorthand, again, is just kind of the grid resilience formula grants. And again, I can run through this pretty quick as Emily covered a number of these points. But the point of this program is to address current and future all hazards grid resilience needs and improve the resilience and reliability of the grid. Just another point here, there is a 15% cost match spelled out in the law from states and tribes that are eligible to apply. And there's also a provision that allows for a maximum of 5% for program administration and technical assistance. The allocation for states and tribes was determined via a 5-part formula. And then I will just point out that states and tribes may, and it is Montana's intention to sub-grant out the vast majority of these funds to eligible entities. And next slide again, please, Ben. These next slides are going to be a repeat largely of what was presented in September, but again, I think it's good to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to what we're talking about for the program. So the requirements for the application, which is known as the program narrative that the Montana Energy Office will be submitting no later than the end of March, include the criteria and methods that we intend to apply to award the grants, a plan for distribution of the funds, and then again, as Emily mentioned, how we have engaged the public and other stakeholders with respect to developing and implementing this program. DOE has encouraged an objectives-led process. We're going to get into some of those objectives here in a minute. Encouraged looking at the economic development and grid modernization opportunities and ensuring that there's documentation of how these investments are serving historically underserved communities. There's another slide on timeline, so I won't spend much time here. The salient point is we expect sometime this month to hear what our year 2 allocation will be for Montana, and will very likely apply for both the year 1 and year 2 funding by that March 31st deadline. Next slide, Ben. So a list of what these funds can be used for, and I won't read through all of these, but we're talking steel in the ground and copper, steel, aluminum, whatever kind of conductors is being put up into the air. Things like pole replacements, monitoring and control equipment, could be for undergrounding existing transmission or distribution lines. And then I will just also highlight that top bullet on the right-hand column there, that microgrids and battery storage components for adaptive capacity during disruptive events are eligible projects. So who can the state of Montana ultimately subaward these funds to? Again, I won't read through the full list, a pretty broad suite of eligible applicants. We certainly expect interest from transmission and distribution owners, but also we'll just point out an opportunity for a wide suite of other eligible applicants. Want to point out some of the federal requirements and limitations on use of these funds. There's going to be, regular reporting requirements, project progression, and other metrics. NEPA will apply. I would point out there's an opportunity potential for categorical exclusions, but some of the other provisions that are impacting these new federal programs, BABA, Build America, Buy America, Davis-Bacon, Prevailing Wage Act. And then a couple of the limitations that are explicitly spelled out is that the funding cannot be used for cybersecurity measures, new generation facilities, or large-scale battery storage that is not used for adaptive capacity. And the other piece that I would point out is that there is a prohibition on seeking cost recovery for a portion of a project that is funded with federal funds. And then, of course, my catch-all bullet that this list isn't exhaustive, but there's likely to be some other strings attached to this funding. So a quick discussion on the cost matching requirements. Again, the federal law requires a 15% match on the federal award by states. And I will just say here that our approach in Montana, without having funding budgeted for that match currently, is to secure that state match requirement from the eligible entities that will ultimately be receiving subawards. DOE has provided clarification that is allowed for under this program, and certainly something that we can discuss further. There's a match requirement of those eligible entities receiving awards, and that's broken down between what is defined in the bill as small utilities, which are those selling less than 4 million megawatt hours of sales annually. Those types of entities are required to match the award for $1 of match for every $3 of subaward, and utilities with over 4 million megawatt hours of sales have to match that federal award 1-to-1. The other thing I wanted to point out in this slide is that a state or Indian tribe receiving a grant under this program must ensure that of the amounts made to subgrantees, the percentage made available to entities that sell not more than that 4 million megawatt hours, so those small utilities, has to be at least the percentage of all customers in the state that are served by those small utilities. A little bit confusing, and again, I won't belabor the point right now, but if there's questions on it, happy to cover that in the Q&A section. Yeah, this slide is just a list of the first year's awards for those entities located in Montana. State of Montana, as Emily mentioned, is eligible for just over $7 million in awards. And then you can see the tribal nation awards listed on this slide as well. And I'll just pause here maybe for any initial questions before we get into Montana's proposed approach. And so Ben, I don't know if there's questions in the Q&A or the chat that now would be a good time to address.
You bet. There are three in here that I think we could get to. First question from Ty Williams in the Q&A window. Will the formula prioritize co-ops who have union employees? So Dan, in Montana's approach, we can discuss this in more detail if you'd like after the next slides, but do you want to address that up front right now?
Sure. So we have not, I guess this is kind of maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we have not established formal criteria for the competitive solicitation that we'll be putting out. So I would say we have not answered Ty's question directly if there will be a direct prioritization of union members, but there will be a strong emphasis on projects that demonstrate good labor standards, good paying jobs, and safe working conditions. So I guess the answer to Ty's question is that's still to be determined exactly how that piece will be scored.
And then the next question, again, Dan, as far as Montana's approaching this, can the 15% cost match, and I think the reference here is the 15% state cost match, be added to the project cost? Want to tackle that?
I'm not sure that I can. And if whoever asked that question would like to further clarify, and I guess what I will say here is, I imagine that the project cost, the physical, CapEx to complete the project kind of is what it is, and the applicant would be allowed to, submit a request for funding at whatever level they determine, as long as it's ensured that the private match requirement and that state match requirement are met to the letter of the law. So I may be.
And Dan, I think you have some additional information in the coming slides about that match. Is that correct?
I believe I do.
Okay. So hopefully we can help you answer that. And if there's still more questions on that, again, feel free to jump back in to clarify your question. Anything more to add on that right now, though, Dan?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the slides will add or will fully address that question, but again, I think there's a little bit more context in the coming slides.
Great. I'm going to turn to Emily for this next question. What is adaptive capacity? Would you mind jumping in there, Emily?
Sure. I mean, we do have a sort of official definition for adaptive capacity in one of the FAQs online, but I will just say briefly that really it's capacity that can be used for resilience purposes. So anything that allows operators of the electrical system to adapt to disruptive events. So that language is actually in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and our interpretation of it is that it is really, the intention is for the battery energy storage systems to be usable for meeting resilience objectives.
Great, thank you, Emily. And if you're able to dig up that FAQ that you referenced,
I can put it in the
drop
chat.
that link in the chat, that would be appreciated. Emily, I think I've got another question for you here from Sylvan Covers Up, who asks, the Crow Tribe has been allocated $429,082. And I would point out that this is the first allocation, the first year allocation under this 5-year program. The question is this determined by the size of the reservation? So Emily, could you speak to how the allocations were determined for states and tribes?
Yes, and it was the same. So the same formula was used for determining allocations for the states, tribes, and U.S. territories. And there was a 5-part formula that was used to do that. One of those factors is the size of the reservation. So the area of geographical area of land that is within the purview of the eligible applicant or entity or the receiver of the formula grant funding. So that was one part of it. The other 4 factors are population, so the number of members of the community. 2 look at historical factors related to grid disruption. So one is the frequency of events over the last 10 years. So primarily weather events that have caused disruptions to energy and electrical infrastructure. One of them was the duration of those disruptions. And then the last factor is the historical investments that have been made to mitigate disruptive events or to improve system resilience. So those are the 5 factors. So in short, yes, the size of the reservation was a part of that formula, but it was only one of 5 parts.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for walking through those pieces. And thank you all for the questions. We will have a chance to circle back on more questions. And again, we'll be asking for your feedback on our approach. Dan, are you ready to jump back into the Montana approach?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, now we're getting into our proposed approach to managing this program for Montana. And so these are, again, proposals, but we have so far identified 4 program objectives that we intend to focus on for our management of this program. And so the first one here is the highest priority of this program and probably the most obvious and straightforward. It's related to reducing the frequency and duration of electrical outages. Again, I think this one is pretty straightforward, but happy to discuss further what our thinking is on this one. Number 2 gets to one of the primary goals of the program as well, and that's to look for projects that have strong and demonstrable community benefits. The other piece of this objective that I think is really important is this term immediate. So we're looking for projects that can be completed with a relatively quick turnaround, but the immediate piece is talking about the benefits that are realized after completion of the project. And again, I mentioned a relatively quick turnaround. We don't expect to put a cap on that timeline to say a project must be completed within 2 years or 3 years. But again, we're looking for projects that have that can demonstrate a clear path to completion, and that again will yield those results upon project completion. And maybe just one more finer point that I will put on that is we wouldn't penalize a project that, let's say, is multi-phase or has some benefits upon its completion, but would rely on future projects to realize additional benefits. But we really do want to have a focus on projects that on a standalone basis can show some real measurable community benefits. The third point here is that we want to support projects, again, that have that workforce component, good paying jobs for Montanans. We want projects that document a strong commitment to worker safety, training, and good pay through the life of the project. And then the final one to point out here is that we're going to be encouraging projects that are innovative. I'll say here, we're not asking for somebody to take some unproven technology and apply it to the grid. We want commercially viable projects but we're hoping for to realize some projects that maybe have limited or even no deployment yet in the state of Montana, that again will ultimately support that primary objective, that our number one objective here of reducing the frequency and duration of outages, but looking for those kind of projects that maybe don't have as widespread adoption in Montana yet. And so how will we track our progress towards meeting those objectives? Again, these are pretty high level here, but we're going to be asking for reporting, I guess, for an initial estimate of the anticipated outcomes of the project. So we're looking for data on the number of customers that will be directly impacted by a project, and that's including some kind of customer class, how many of those are residential versus commercial versus industrial, and then also general demographic information on the type of customer that's going to be impacted by this project. This second bullet here are the pretty industry standard outage information. And so again, we're looking for some of the existing or historic data on outages, but then what the anticipated impact will be of a project on those metrics. The third bullet here is the community benefits that we've talked about. So direct and indirect economic impacts to those communities. I'll say that we're not looking for a peer-reviewed, independent third-party economic impact analysis, but really what we're thinking here is, as much as possible, a quantification of the impacts of the reduced costs on things like vegetation management or improved economic activity from reduced outages. This could include things like, other economic and efficiencies of, let's say, the generator runtime for a hospital that's served by this, the proposed project. Maybe not totally relevant in Montana, but thinking of things like quantifying the impacts of public safety power shutoffs that could be avoided by these projects. And so I'll leave that one there. I expect there'll be a lot of questions around that one. And then the final program metrics that we're highlighting today is that it's important to demonstrate the direct job impacts of the project. So total number of jobs or man hours, average wage, any training programs offered, or how this project will be leveraged into workforce opportunities for future projects. So our year one tentative approach, as I mentioned early on, there's an allowance for up to 5% of the award to be used for technical assistance and program administration. We will certainly not use more than that 5% because we're not allowed to, but we're hoping to use less than that 5%, some of which is going to depend upon what we receive for our year two allocation. Again, as mentioned, we expect that this first year or two approach will require that any successful applicant to provide that 15% state match, state cost share requirement. Again, as I've kind of alluded to, but maybe we'll hit more directly here. Our approach will be to issue a competitive solicitation. So to put an announcement of funding availability out there with transparent scoring criteria on how we intend to evaluate one project against the next. Obviously, that competitive solicitation will be designed to follow all applicable federal and state procurement requirements. And then, as I mentioned, our initial year's focus is going to be on those kind of projects that can demonstrate a clear path to completion in the relatively near term, and that ultimately result in immediate community benefits. And then, of course, we will be quantifying and monitoring the impacts of all funded projects. Moving forward. So how do we get there? Sorry, Ben, next slide. We had an initial public hearing on September 19th that went over some of this information, but not in as much detail on our approach, which is what we're discussing here today. We're going to release a draft of our program narrative that again will be based on some of the conversation that we have today for feedback. By early February, we're going to give folks at least 2 weeks to review that specific language and provide feedback. Red line edits, general feedback. We'll take any input that folks want to provide, and then we'll be submitting our application to the Department of Energy no later than that deadline of March 31st. I think we've got an internal goal of having it in at least a couple weeks early. And then based on those timelines, we would expect to release our first competitive solicitation in the summer, potentially late summer, even early fall, depending on how long those reviews take and just the kind of logistical mechanics of us receiving the funds. But we'll be developing that solicitation between now and this summer to have that first solicitation out around the middle of 2023. So on this slide, I just wanted to tee up the conversation to see if folks on the call today have any responses to these prompts. Again, I can read through them, but I think you can all see. My hope is to just say, is our approach understandable and reasonable? Are there any major concerns about providing the kind of data that was discussed? I have some questions about is it reasonable to come up with some of these anticipated outcomes that we're thinking, and if folks have ideas on any specific metrics, we'd be happy to hear that. And Ben, I think we can maybe stick on this slide if we want to open it up for Q&A.
Sounds good. And while folks think about responses to these questions we're posing to you, there's at least one question in the Q&A window right now that we'll jump to. Again, feel free to drop questions into the chat window or the Q&A, or raise your hand, and we'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can give us your thoughts or ask your question. So to the question that's in the Q&A from Bill Pasco, how does wildland fire risk factor into the program objectives? Dan, do you want to take that one in terms of how we're looking at this from the Montana perspective?
You bet. So wildfire risk is obviously a big grid reliability issue in the West. We've all seen the impacts out of California in recent years, and Oregon and Washington as well as Montana, right here at home. And so we anticipate strong applications that will be addressing wildfire risk. I'll say that we've had internal discussions of prioritizing wildfire projects that mitigate wildfire impacts, but ultimately where we landed was rather than focusing on one risk factor or hazard, to take an all hazards approach and not weigh addressing one specific hazard over another. So if it's a risk that's posed by aging infrastructure, poles that are reaching the end of their useful life, we want to evaluate that kind of a project as much as possible, apples to apples, to one that would mitigate wildfire risk, or one that would result in improved monitoring and communications ability. So again, Bill, I think we recognize the impact that wildfires are having on the reliability of the grid and expect some applications, but are taking an all hazards approach.
Great, thanks, Dan. We've got a question on timelines and oops, let me get to the right slide there. Dan, the question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee is, could you expand on the submittal dates for year 1 and 2 on March 31st, 2023? And maybe in your response, clarify, whose deadlines these are.
Sure, and I'm happy to let Emily jump in, as I think her statement was a little more definitive than was my understanding. So the current proposal deadline for year 1 is March 31st, 2023. As many of you probably know, the initial application deadline was for the end of September, and that was extended to March 31st. DOE has been clear that the year 2 allocations will be published at some point in January. So we will know what our year 2 allocation is prior to that March 31st deadline, and we will have the opportunity to apply for both year 1 and year 2 funding in that same program narrative, in that same application cycle. Unless it is required to do that, our intention was to apply for both year 1 and year 2, but we have not made that decision definitively again, unless that's required. And Emily, I don't know if you want to clarify or correct any statements I made there.
Yeah, no, and I will clarify that the year 1 and year 2 deadline is March 31st. The good news is that applying for both should be pretty straightforward. As you know, unless you anticipate dramatically different approaches to utilizing your year 1 and year 2 allocations, that same program narrative should be applicable for both years.
And again, just to underline this, that March 31st deadline is for Dan and me to worry about, not utilities in Montana who might be ultimately applying to our office for that funds when we release a competitive solicitation. Just to reemphasize that. Great. Next question. Maybe Emily, you could take this in case there's really clear guidance from DOE in on this question from Ashley Keltner. Where in the job status timeline could projects qualify for this program? Could money be budgeted, contract signed, construction started, et cetera?
I think maybe the question is related to if projects are already scoped and budgeted, could they still be eligible to apply for grant funding?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, because there's also the flip side question, and I can speak to that too, like how quickly do things have to get done? Largely, this through the formula grant funding, this will be at the discretion of Montana on how to address this. In general, the expectation is that grant funding, and this is a hard requirement. Grant funding cost recovery cannot be. You cannot recover costs for grant funding, of course. So, if cost recovery is already being planned for projects, and those projects are already underway, there would be a complexity in trying to then use grant funding for those projects, because there would be some questions around whether that was sort of if there was sort of double dipping or sort of if that grant funding was being accounted for in other ways. That said, there is no prohibition within DOE for cost recovery on match right? So if there are projects that are being pushed forward, and part of the project, and this is at the DOE level, Montana will have its own approach to these things, but I'm just speaking for DOE, there is no prohibition against cost recovery for matching funds at the utility level. So if a project is being partially supported by grant funding and partially rate recovery is covering the match, that is appropriate. But for this specific instance, it would have to be clear how the grant funding was separate from other funding sources, and it would ultimately be Montana's decision about how to evaluate that, as long as that was really clear that the federal funding was separate from any other funding sources.
Thank you, Emily. I want to turn back to you in a second on that sort of flip side of that you offered up. But Dan, anything more to say on Montana's approach with regard to this question of whether projects that are already budgeted, begun, would qualify for funding?
Sure. And I guess what I would say is that would be will be definitively spelled out in the request for proposals, the competitive solicitation on what costs are eligible to be considered match. So I would certainly think a project that's budgeted, has contract signed but hasn't expended funds, that would be pretty straightforward to determine that project would be eligible for funding. If construction had been started and funds had been expended, I think there's still an open question as to whether we would want to allow for those as eligible costs. But a good question, and one that I've added to our list to further contemplate as we refine our program narrative and add some details to how we will approach this.
Thanks, Dan. And Emily, back to that sort of flip side of things, the timeline for expending these funds and for projects to be completed. Could you speak to the DOE requirements on the other end?
Yeah, so there's the grant funding from DOE has a 5-year period of performance, and that's sort of a rolling window, right? Because this is a 5-year program, so you kind of imagine that there's a 5-year window starting from when the grant funds are distributed from DOE to eligible applicants, and then as year 2, year 3, that sort of window rolls out. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a sort of a cap to how long projects can take, but it is a minimum of 5 years. So it could be longer depending upon how Montana administers the program.
Thanks, Emily. Next question, again from an anonymous attendee. Will you be limiting funding to regulated utilities and co-ops, or will third-party developers be eligible for funding? Dan, I'm going to go ahead and flip back up to the eligible entities slide while you tackle this question.
Yeah, so I guess the long and short of it is, here's the list pulled directly from the bipartisan infrastructure law on entities that are explicitly eligible. You will all notice that last bullet is any other relevant entity as determined by the Secretary of Department of Energy. And so our intention would be to leave Montana's program open to the widest suite of eligible applicants as possible. Of course, those entities would have to be eligible under other parts of other provisions of the bill. And so I guess, brief summary of that response is that, yes, I think third-party developers could be eligible, assuming that they, A, meet one of these existing definitions, or B, are deemed relevant by the Secretary of DOE. And I don't know if Emily's faced that question before and has a different response.
I guess the only thing that I will add is that, you know, we have been working through a process for getting approval for entities that are not on this list. And our expectation is that, you know, in order, if there was a desire to have somebody who is not explicitly fall within one of these buckets, be deemed an eligible entity, that what would be required is that there be some demonstration of the sort of that there was community benefit associated with that entity being a recipient of this funding, and that they would, you know, their ability to help realize or realize the goals of the formula grant funding. And so we are working through that process. We have had questions around that. We do expect that there will be requests to make entities not on this list eligible, and we expect that will be possible, given that those pieces are in place, that there's a demonstration that it will provide community benefit and that it will fall within the goals of the formula grant program.
Great, thank you both. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A or chat. I'm going to jump back down to the questions that we're looking for feedback on. And understandably, if you don't have comments today, we would certainly welcome feedback again on the timeline. We're looking for feedback to our office, to the Montana Energy Office, no later than February 17th. And the questions again, are the objectives that we've outlined, are they understandable? Are the proposed metrics reasonable? And do you have any suggestions for additional or different metrics that we should consider as we develop our application to the Department of Energy and our approach for how we're going to prioritize these funds? Also want to give folks a chance if they would prefer to raise their hand and come off mute, then feel free to do that. And we'll take questions on air. Looks like we've got one more question. Is a distribution provider eligible to submit multiple projects? If this is possible, how does that affect the previous 3-year spending requirement? Maybe we start with Emily on that. Any overarching DOE guidance on this question of whether a distribution provider is eligible to submit multiple projects and how that jives with the timeline requirements?
I will say that, you know, as with all things related to the formula grant funding, I will provide the sort of the limitations from the DOE perspective, but that the specifics will be up to Montana and how it's implemented. From the DOE perspective, as long as the projects are distinct, there is no prohibition for entities submitting multiple proposals and being funded for multiple projects. So it needs to be clear that the projects are different, and that there is, you know, a clear line of funding, and that there's no sort of double counting of funds. But other than that, yes, that would be allowable within the DOE's, you know, guidelines or sort of, you know, boundary conditions. As far as the 3-year spending requirement, I don't know if this is separate from the 5-year sort of period of performance that I was mentioning within DOE's, from the DOE side, from the law, from the BIL, it's actually a 5-year period of performance, but that if there were multiple projects funded under the same funding cycle from the same distribution provider, they would all be subject to that same period of performance. So they would have to be, you know, they would all fall within that same window. If, you know, and then that is of course a rolling window. And then I will, but again, that's from the DOE perspective, and ultimately it's up to Montana.
You bet. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's helpful to hear that sort of overarching, you know, framework that Montana is working within. Dan, do you want to filter it down to the Montana approach? Do you have any more specifics that you'd like to add in terms of how we're proposing to approach these questions?
Yeah, happy to. And I think I'm interpreting that second question a little bit differently than Emily. So, but first on the first question here about would an eligible entity be able to submit multiple projects in one funding cycle, the answer to that is absolutely our intention, is not to limit an eligible applicant to one project under this program. DOE has some additional limitations based on the language of the law that doesn't allow for submitting the same project to multiple of the different transmission funding opportunities out there in the same project year. But if that first question is specific to Montana's program, yes, entities will very likely be eligible to submit multiple projects. The second question is related to, I think, provisions in other transmission funding programs that require, and I frankly don't remember exactly what this requirement is, but it's, I can't remember if it's a maximum that you can't apply for more funding than the entity has spent in 3 years, but those are for other transmission programs. That 3-year spending requirement does not apply to the state and tribal grid resiliency funds.
Great. I hope that answered your question. Again, feel free to raise your hand if you've got any clarifying questions there.
Maybe while we have a quick lull in the questions, I'll just, Ben, if you just want to scroll down to the last slide really quick, just make sure folks have my contact information to provide any initial feedback, and we'll again reiterate that we will be providing a draft program narrative here in the coming weeks that will allow folks to give more kind of red line specific feedback or comments to our approach. But just based on the information presented here today, would encourage folks to reach out. Something that I didn't include in the presentation, we're going to be filling a currently vacant position that's being repurposed specifically to help implement this program, as well as undertake some of our obligations to support transmission and distribution planning. So we currently have an open job opportunity for a grid analyst that will take over day-to-day management of this program when they come on board. But for the time being, I'm serving as the point of contact for development of this program.
And I am racing to dig up that link to the job posting. And we'll leave it open for questions for another minute here.
As Ben is digging up this link to the job posting, I'll maybe just extend my appreciation again to Emily for her help throughout our development of our proposed program. Thank you all for your time and participation and interest here today. We'll be again reaching out with additional information and communicating with you all in the coming months as we get our program established and get our application submitted by that March deadline. But
And I'd add my thanks. I did just post the job posting in the chat window. Applications will be accepted through January 13th. So if you're interested, or you know someone who might be a good fit, please feel free to share this link around. There's a lot of work to do on this front, and we're really excited to bring on someone to fill this new position in our office. I think we can wrap it up there. Emily, thank you for joining us and for helping answer these questions and giving us the big picture here today. And Dan, thanks for walking through the Montana approach. These slides and a recording of this presentation will be shared in an email that we'll send around in the next couple of days here to the registered webinar participants. And again, feel free to reach out to Dan as the primary point of contact at this point on this program if you have further questions or feedback, input on our approach. So thanks again and have a good day.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks for all
thanks,
the
Emily.
questions.
Thanks all.